weird animals that might hurt you. And that's a real category. You know, you might say, well, there's differentiated things within that category. It's like, yeah, every category has that nature. It can still be further differentiated, maybe not protons, you know. They can even be differentiated with regards to location at least. So every category can be further differentiated. The question is whether the category has some functional utility, or at least that's one of its questions. It's like, that's the thing to be afraid of. Okay, good, now you got it. This is the category of all things to be afraid of. What do you do in response to that category? All right, so then we go to the next representation. This is Kali, K-A-L-I, Hindu goddess of destruction. She's the thing that you encounter. She's the thing that makes things go bump in the night. What is that thing? Well, let's take it apart a little bit, because you can't see this image until you understand it. You would be able to if you were Hindu, because you'd be in the culture and you'd know what the image represented, but some people in here might be Hindu, but not very many people. So, okay, so let's talk about this image. It's a horrifying image, and so here's how this image emerged. It emerged in the imagination of people who were tormented for millennia about just what the hell lurked out there in the unknown. And some artist was seized by a revelation, a horrifying revelation of just what that was. Okay, so what is it? Well, first of all, she's in a container of fire. Why fire? Well, fire is useful and destructive, right? And you also cannot look away from fire. And so it's a really good symbol of that which you cannot look away from. It's eternally meaningful. Fire is eternally meaningful. Why? We can't keep our hands off fire, right? We're descendants of the first insane ape who was so obsessed by fire that he couldn't stay away from a burning landscape and learned how to master it. He's our forefather, that person. We're obsessed by fire. It's magical to us. And it transforms, it burns and transforms. So from a symbolic perspective, it's a very useful source of imagistic representation. Okay, the fire is there, and then inside the fire, these are skulls. You see them? All lined up there. So it's not just fire, it's the fire of death that consumes. So that's where Kelly lives. So that's fun to start with. And then there she is with her hair on fire, because her hair's on fire, in case she isn't frightening enough just because of where she lives. Her hair is on fire, and her headdress is made out of skulls. So that's nice. And then she's like an insect, like a spider. See, she has all these legs. And why is that? It's because we don't really like insects. And, you know, they set off our bug detectors and they can bite us, and they're quite horrifying. And many people have spider phobias particularly. And no wonder. And then she's got a weapon in one hand here, and then you see she's eating something. And you see here her belly is concave. Well, why? Well, she's in a birth position. She's just given birth to this unfortunate character who she happens to be standing upon, and he's disemboweled, and she's eating him intestines first. And that's Kelly. It's like, that's horror. It's a representation of horror and death and destruction and transformation. It's feminine as well. What do you do in the face of Mother Nature? That's another negative element of Mother Nature. What do you do with something like this? Well, that's the eternal question. And the answer is quite straightforward. You make sacrifices to her. And if you make the proper sacrifices, then she turns into her beneficial counterpart. And that's exactly what you do in life. If in the face of horror and death, you make sacrifices, so you transform the terrible destructive element of nature into that thing that continually offers you what you need. That discovery is one of unparalleled brilliance. And you know, we don't get it. We think it's primitive. And no wonder, you know, you can understand human sacrifice. That sounds pretty primitive, man. It's terrifying. But the idea of sacrifice, it's an act of, the idea itself is a conceptualization of utter genius. And why do you expect it to come forward first in its perfect form? It's not going to do that. It's going to come forward imperfectly and roughly and brutally, and then hopefully be refined across time, which is exactly what has happened. You see, even in the biblical stories, the transition from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. And then with us now, it's the transition from animal sacrifice to psychological sacrifice, because we're sophisticated enough to do that. We can let go of concepts and abstractions and things that we're holding on to that we should no longer hold on to, and progress in that manner. It's increasing articulated psychological sophistication. But we still make sacrifices, and we hope that they'll be accepted, and we hope that they're of high enough quality so that they work. Well, that's a representation of Diana. You could think of Diana, there's an opposite, Durga, in Hinduism, and she comes forth if you make the proper sacrifices to Kali. But I wanted to show you alternative representations from different cultures of these archetypal forms. This is Diana, positive feminine, multi-breasted, right? She's the thing that nourishes the world, and so that would be, on one hand, your mother, who obviously protects you from the terrible aspects of fire and danger, but also nature conceptualized as the positive feminine in general. The source of all fertility and all food and all beings and all good things. Something that you want to have on your side, that's for sure. And you might say, if you acted heroically, properly, and you played the metagame and not the game, and you made the proper sacrifices, then you'd never encounter Kali, you'd only encounter her benevolent counterpart. And so then you might say, well, does she even exist then? And that's something that's very interesting, is because the degree to which the terrible part of the world manifests itself in your life is proportionate to how insufficient you are. And we don't know the full extent of that. If you got your act together completely, maybe all the suffering would disappear from your life, or at least maybe all the unbearable suffering, and maybe all the suffering or the unbearable suffering from the lives of people around you too. And you already know that, because there are people that you'll go to in a crisis that you can rely on, and you know they'll help you, and you wonder what the world would be like if you were like that and everyone else was like that too. We'd have a lot fewer crises, and the ones that we do have would be a lot more manageable. And so when people say, well, why is the world so rife with suffering? One answer to that is because we're not yet what we could be. And at least that's an answer that we have some control over, right? You're not going to talk God out of making the world suffer, that's for sure. And you're not going to negotiate directly with Mother Nature, but you might be able to put yourself together a little bit and see if that works. At least it's under your control. And God only knows what the upper limit of that might be. Well, here's the decomposition of the fundamental archetype. The dragon of chaos differentiates, on the one hand, into the feminine, that's the unknown, and the feminine differentiates further into the negative feminine and the positive feminine. The negative feminine is the reason for witch hunts. It's the reason for, you know, there's a whole group online called Men Going Their Own Way, MGTOW. That's a very interesting group to go study. There's lots of them. I don't know how many of them there are, and most of them are older. Many of them are men who've been through a particularly horrifying divorce for one reason or another, and they've had enough of women. So they tell the young men that they're teaching, never have a permanent relationship, never share your territory with a woman, never share your possessions, make sure you never live together, and don't stay with one long enough to enter a common law relationship, because you will be stripped of everything that you have. Well, that's a hell of a thing to be telling people. But what's happened is that the female has been manifested in their life only as the negative archetype, and they've got that confused with all women. And that's partly, you know, you got to ask yourself, if you know the mythological stories, maybe if you made the right sacrifices, you wouldn't have so much trouble with women. It's a good question to ask yourself first. And I would also say, you know, if you're a woman who has trouble with men, or you're a man who has trouble with women, it's not the women and it's not the men, it's you. Because the women are telling you what's wrong with you, and the men are telling you what's wrong with you. And if you don't listen, then it's you. It's either you or all men. Well, that's easy, it's all men. Well, that's certainly how it's played out in the world right now. It's like, no, it's not all men. You can be, by definition. And it's not all women, that's for sure. I don't want to have anything to do with women. It's like you're a pathetic weasel. That's the same statement. Here's some lovely representations. This is Mary, represented in very different eras. This is a very old one. This is about 12th century. I absolutely love this image. It's so profound. So what you see here is Mary as eternal mother of the infant. Okay, she's sitting on the crescent moon here. She's queen of the night. And underneath, you can't see this very well, but underneath the moon there's a reptile, and she's got it crunched nicely underneath her feet, and that's Satan in part, which means protect your children from malevolence, and it's the predator. And so what's the proper orientation for a mother? Protect your infant from malevolent predators, obviously, right? That's the holy image of the mother. So she's holding the infant safely in her arms. She's queen of the universe, and she's coming out of this strange tunnel. It's the same, these are called a mandorla, by the way, this tunnel. And it's actually, this is going to be very strange, but I'm going to tell you what it is anyways. It's like a hole into the fabric of time and space, and it's revealing an image that's eternal, that's outside of time and space. And it's outside of time and space because it recurs all the time. It never ages. It's an image that transcends temporality. Now you might say, well, is it real? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean by real. Something that transcends temporality is pretty damn real. And so that's what that hole in the sky represents. It also represents the place from which all forms emerge. So there's a biological component to it too, right? So it's as if these divine figures are standing in front. Well, I'll show you in a minute of what they're standing in front of. And you see here the same thing with these little putti, that's what they're called, sort of embedded in the flesh-like folds around here. And you see Mary here holding the infant again away from the terrible predator. That's the serpent of chaos down there in the ocean. And that's, again, what does that mean? Why would the serpent of chaos be in the ocean? Well, how many of our ancestral infants do you suppose were eaten by crocodiles at the water hole? And plenty of them. And so that's something to be terrified of and to take precautions against. And then this image here, the older one, see all these weird little figures in the background here. You can't see them, but they're musical instruments. They're all sorts of archaic musical instruments. And so here's what the image means. It means the potential from which this figure is emerging is like a musical construction. So it's like a symphony. It's this patterned layer. It's patterns, layer upon layers of harmonious patterns that make up being. And out of that emerges this image. And that's what that image represents. And that's what music represents. It represents this patterned potential that we're constantly interacting with. It's deeply, deeply meaningful. That's why we love music so much. But that's an absolute work of genius to put those two things together. It's remarkable image. So. Well, let's stop there and we'll meet again in 15 minutes. And then this, so that's the positive feminine on the left. And then on the right, that's the Gorgon, and that's the thing that fills you with terror when you look at it. There's another representation of the positive feminine. It's another representation of Mary. There are representations very much like this of Isis with Horus on her lap. And people often consider those precursors, they're Egyptian statues, precursors to the Christian iconography. And well, I suppose in some sense they are, insofar as they predated them in time, but the fundamental issue is that, well, this image has to be held up as transcendent, and by that I mean it's an image that's got to be at the basis of a value structure that actually works insofar as there's going to be human beings, because there aren't any human beings without the infant and the mother. And so if that's not held up as an image of ultimate value, then everything falls apart. And it's something our culture does extraordinarily badly. I had a client recently admit to me in ashamed tones that she wanted to have children. I said, well, you don't have to be ashamed of that, especially not if you're talking to me. And she said, oh, that's such a relief, because I can't talk to anyone about it at work. They seem to think that it's, degrading. I thought that you can hardly diagnose a culture as more pathological than that. That's so appalling, and it's so hard. It's one of the things I really feel badly for young women, because they're not guided through this with any sense whatsoever. And I'll tell you what my experience has been working with women, and you can take this for what it's worth. And I've worked with women who've achieved the highest levels of their profession. I don't mean just in academia, but in a number of different fields. This is what happens. We'll take the typical woman, conservative woman, because they're more typical, conscientious, not particularly open. So they're dutiful people, they're existing within the structures of their society. So I'll take female lawyers as a classic example. So they're very good in high school, very hardworking, very intelligent, but very dutiful, and often rather agreeable. And that's important because it means to some degree that they want to please and they'll do what they're told. And so part of the reason I think that women are outperforming men in elementary, junior high school, and university is because they're more likely to be obedient.